used oil analysis provide a tremendous amount of insight for us when we're looking at them. For our warranty purposes, it is required to get a used oil analysis at every oil change. And that allows us to see not only how well the engine is breaking in, but also do early identification of any problems so that if we're seeing something we don't like, we have the opportunity to bring the engine back in and proactively fix it before a failure would occur. The other thing it allows us to do is monitor different types of oils and see how each engine under that specific use case is wearing from that oil selection. So it allows us to gain insights into if our recommendations are working well for that application or if we need to, for instance, recommend a different oil. So just kind of starting off, the first thing we look at is obviously what oil's being used and what grade it is. On many of these engines, Porsche recommended a 0W40 Mobile 1, and essentially that's a 30 weight oil. So the minimum spec on a 40 weight oil is, I believe, 12.5 centistrokes at 100 degrees Celsius. And a new Mobile One 0W40 comes right in there. I believe that that's for two reasons. One, I think it was for emissions purposes because the lighter of an oil you use, the less friction it has on the engine, and so the better gas mileage you're going to get. The other thing is, I believe it was because of the lifters, and the lifters want, especially at a low idle, a very thin oil to be able to get in there and keep them pumped up while the engine is running at a lower oil pressure. The downside to that is one, the oil pumps aren't able to pump as efficiently, both the main oil pump and the two scavenge pumps, with a lighter weight oil. And then also that lighter weight oil goes through the bearing clearances much quicker and doesn't hold as much system pressure in the engine. Typically at, if your max oil temp is around the 212 degrees Fahrenheit that these oils are rated at, that's typically not a problem. But most of these aren't cruising Porsches. They are performance Porsches, and they demand to be driven aggressively if you listen to them. What we try to do is provide recommendations that allow them to be pushed to their limits on a consistent basis safely. Now then, that touches on an entirely different topic, which is how to prevent oil starvation, which we will get to in another question. For now, we'll just stay focused on the oil analysis. So after looking at the viscosity grade, I want to see what the viscosity is at 100C, and that tells me how well the oil is holding up. Essentially, on the most oils, the viscosity comes from viscosity modifier additives. And so the more life, and specifically, most of my answers are going to apply to synthetic oil specifically, because other than the break-in oil we use initially, we do not recommend running conventional oils or blended oils in these engines. What I want to see initially is the viscosity at 100C. Most oils use a additive package that contains viscosity modifiers to hit their viscosity rating. That's why they have a life on them. And as the oil gets more wear and more use on it, those viscosity modifiers are going to wear out. And so we'll see that viscosity come down with use. I can look at that viscosity at 100C and tell, okay, this is a relative fresh oil, if it's somewhere near its new oil viscosity rating, or if it's dropped down a couple centistrokes, then that's probably okay. That's what we would expect to see on normal usage. If it's down 4 or 5 centistrokes, then we know that oil has either been used too long or it's had some type of an event that broke it down early. And so that becomes a red flag at that point. The next thing we're going to look at, the oxidation value will help you tell between like what the base oil is. That's not as big of a deal. Fuel dilution, we are interested in that. That can be a problem, but typically we don't see a lot of that. Where you would see that is if the injectors were running rich, for instance, and you had a sticky injector that was putting too much fuel in the cylinder. However, the ECUs do monitor for that, and they will either handle that with short-term fuel trims typically, which may or may not help, because the fuel trims are going to be based on an average of the three cylinders, not a particular cylinder. But then it's going to eventually cause a fault by the ECU if it's consistently having to provide too much trim. So if the ECU doesn't fault out, and maybe you've got one injector that's a little light and one that's sticky and over oiling, and the fuel dilution is typically where we would be able to recognize and catch that. So the next one, water. We want to know how much water's in it. That could be if we've got a cracked head or something to that effect, or we've got some intermix. That's where that's typically going to show up. Also, if there was a blown head gasket, we would see it there. Somebody tells us they've got a blown head gasket. While we would be able to see that on the used oil analysis, our assumption is pretty much that it's not a blown head gasket, as these MLS head gaskets aren't really a weak point on this engine. Next thing that we're interested in is the silicone levels. That can be associated with the oil. If it's a recent rebuild, that's where we're going to see some of the sealants that we used or how much sealant we've used. It can also be a sign of debris if it's a bad air filter and too much debris is getting through the engine. So we pay attention to that. And then we look at the additive package. And this is what we're really interested in. And so this is, what does the additive package look like at the end? And so all of the oils that we recommend, we have a new oil analysis on. And so we know about where that should be. Now those vary from barrel to barrel or bottle to bottle, but we know approximately how many parts per million of each of the additives should be there. The first type of additive that we're looking at is the amount of detergents in the oil. And there's typically three different detergents used: calcium, sodium, and magnesium. Really, the one you want to see the least of is the sodium. That's not a great detergent, something we don't want to see much of. Typically, we want to see calcium as the main detergent, and then maybe a little magnesium to go with it. And as far as that, for track engines, we want to see a lower detergent package than the friction modifier package. On a street engine, it can be somewhere around the same, but we want to see some balance there. Rarely do we want to see a detergent package that exceeds the friction modifier package. The three main friction modifiers we're looking at is phosphorus, zinc, and molybdenum. And actually, it's the phosphorus and the moly that we really care about. The zinc is not actually a friction modifier. It's just a carrier for the phosphorus. And so we're looking at phosphorus plus moly is the friction modifier package. So at a base level, we want to see the moly and the phosphorus combined together be at or above the detergent level. Now then, that can go too far. You hear about the high ZDDP levels affecting the cats, and that's on some of the older race oils where we're seeing 2,000, 3,000 parts per million ZDP. All of the newer, higher tech oils that do have a higher protection package, we're typically going to see that somewhere around, say, 1,000 to 1,500, kind of that 12 to 1,300 range is a nice sweet spot for us. From there, then we're looking at the wear metals as far as the health of the engine. One, you've got your overall wear metals that will be based on wear per 1,000 miles. So how many parts per million of total wear metal do I have per 1,000 miles? And that's going to let me know overall how well the engine is wearing with this particular oil. But then more importantly, what I'm looking for is outliers. Like if they're all even, then I know the engine's wearing pretty even, pretty healthy. On a new engine, we're typically going to see extra iron, based on the oil that's used. Sometimes we'll see extra tin. Some of the oil content actually has tin in it, and we'll spike that value. And so that's what we expect to see. Maybe some aluminum or some nickel and extra silicone if there's a little bit of wear happening on the cylinders, but we wouldn't expect to see much as those rings are seating in, particularly on our cylinders, which are Nicosil plated. What that means is it's going to be part nickel and part silicone. And so we would look for higher values there if we thought that there was some wear on the cylinders. But the Nicosil is 70% harder on average than a steel cylinder. And so rarely are they going to wear. Even if you look in a typical Nicosil cylinder, whether it's ours or a competitor's, and you see some streaking in there, something that looks like bore scoring, when you open that up and run your fingernail across it, it's going to be smooth as can be. Or a lot of times, if you shine the light on it from the bore scope just right, you'll see that the crosshatch actually goes through it and that it's not actually any wear on the cylinders. The big one I'm looking for on any used oil analysis that's sent to me from an engine that we don't know, or that, one of our engines, is copper. Copper is the one that whenever copper starts spiking, copper is the third layer in the rod bearings. And probably 75% of the engine failures that we see are from spun rod bearings due to oil starvation. And so as soon as I start seeing elevated amounts of copper in an oil analysis, that's the biggest red flag for me. And when I recommend to start really taking note and paying attention. Then on the bore scoring, what we're going to see is aluminum and silicone. And so if we see elevated aluminum along with an elevated silicone level on an engine that hasn't been rebuilt, hasn't had the sump pulled lately, then that's going to be somewhat indicative of the bore scoring. The other type of failure that we can spot early signs of in the oil reports is the IMS failure. Typically, we're only looking for this with the small bearing IMSs, or maybe the early dual roll bearing IMSs, depending on how it's been cared for and what type of oil it's seen. The indicative factor of an IMS bearing failure, we're going to see elevated levels of iron and even some chromium compared to the rest of them. And so that's kind of the signature that we can look for that failure. Essentially, in summation, we can get a pretty good sign if the engine's seeing bore scoring, if it's seeing on its way to a rod bearing failure, if it's on its way to an IMS failure. Those are all failures that we can see early detection warnings from. And then we can also see how well the oil is holding up at the change intervals that are being used, as well as does the overall wear metals in the engine, is that showing that the engine does like that oil, or that's the best. So while we will make oil recommendations or suggestions a lot of time, the ultimate guide that we use is the oil report. We say, let the oil report, or let your engine be the guide as to what oil it wants you to use.
Hmm. So I'm hearing listen to your engine and get your oil check.
Yes, absolutely.